And now please join me in welcoming to the stage Deepak Homebase's co-founder, Deepak Chopra, with his guests, Barry Vaid and Gita Vaid and Barry Walker. Come on up.
Thank you for that beautiful ceremony. As we were doing it, I was thinking we should have done that at the end because the experience was so beautiful, and now we're going to ruin it for you by talking. So, as an introduction, three of us are from very different backgrounds. I'm a physician with interest in neuroscience and neuroendocrinology and healing. Gita is also a physician, but she's also a psychiatrist and very interested in both emotional and physical healing. And Barry Walker is a psychologist who has helped many people get over their phobias and anxieties and depression. I'd like to start off by saying two things, one from a very Eastern perspective and one from a Western perspective. So let me talk to you from the Western perspective first. If you do a meta-analysis of what is the major cause or the underlying factor in almost every chronic disease, except for the 5% of disease-related gene mutations that are fully penetrant, you will see that there's emerging evidence that there's a background of chronic inflammation in the body, in the brain, in the body, and of course in the mind, because body and mind are not separate, in almost every illness. And then if you look a little deeper, you'll also find that there is a pandemic in the world today of what is called free-floating anxiety, which means people are fearful and angry also, but mainly fearful and anxious and can't identify a cause. And it's very related also to a free-floating depression. There's no obvious cause for the depression. And these three things, low-grade inflammation, anxiety, existential anxiety, for lack of a better word, and depression precede chronic illness by many, many, many years. And this is becoming obvious now. And by chronic illness, I mean everything from heart disease to cancer to Alzheimer's to type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, on and on. So remember, those three things are always present in chronic illness: anxiety, depression, low-grade inflammation. Now, from the Eastern perspective, in the Vedanta, I was reading a verse recently, which was so beautiful. It said, space begins when we have a body. Space begins when we have a body. Body, 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 space. Time begins when we start thinking. Time begins when we start thinking. Limitations begin, or causality, cause-effect, karma begins when we lose memory of the infinite. So when we lose memory of the infinite, the separate self is born. And so in the great wisdom traditions of the East, human suffering comes from 5 causes. These are called kleshas. Klesha is a Sanskrit word which means human suffering. The first klesha is not knowing who you really are, confusing yourself with an experience that we call the body-mind. The second klesha is clinging and grasping that which is a dream. This is a dream right now. This is a lucid dream in a vivid now. What happened a second ago is over. What is happening a second from now, even a trillionth of a second from now, is over. That's why Wittgenstein, the German philosopher, said, our life is a dream, we are asleep, but once in a while, we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. So tonight is actually about waking up. So that's the second klesha. The third klesha is fear of impermanence, because everything is moving, nothing stays put. The fourth is identifying with the constricted self, a socially induced hallucination called the ego. And the fifth is the fear of death. Now, whether you know it or not, you're caught in this web. Whether you know it or not, you're caught in this web. Everybody is. To be human is to feel separate, and that is not the fundamental reality. If you're a baby without any constructs and you haven't learned language, and I asked you, what is this? What is this? What am I pointing to? Space. But what am I pointing to? Shoe. So that's a human construct, right? Because if you're a baby, all you see is a color, a shape, a form, and that is actually a modified expression of yourself. Shape, color, form do not exist in the world. They exist only in consciousness. And they're modifications of consciousness. The word shoe is a human construct, as is money, as is Wall Street, as is the body. Body is a human construct. There's no such thing. The body is a modified experience of your own self. So everything that you look at is your own self, whether you know it or not. But we are presented every moment and reinforced into the idea of the separate self. The extreme opposite of that is what has become a buzzword now, unconditional love. But what is that unconditional love? It's the deepest knowing of the profound interconnectivity and inseparability of all existence. So as the great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore said, love is not just a sentiment or a emotion, it's the ultimate truth at the heart of creation. And everyone said love is the key to healing. Without understanding what love is, we usually think of it as in terms of emotions, which is a flavor of love, but it's not love at its source, which is that we're all the same being in different disguises. So with that, I'd like to start this conversation today with Gita, who's an MD, as I said, and we're all friends here. I want to just caution everyone, since we're on Facebook, and maybe a lot of people in the world are watching us, I'm sure. This is not an evening for an endorsement of the recreational use of illegal drugs. I'll repeat that. This is not an evening for the endorsement for the use of recreational drugs. It's a much more profound discussion about healing. So let's start with Gita, with the background I've laid out, and all this new knowledge about the default mode network in the brain. Can you say a little bit about your experience in treating patients with ketamine or other substances that basically deactivate the default mode network? What is it?
Thank you. So psychiatry and psychology is getting very interested in psychedelics and the impact on the brain. And there's been a lot of excitement in research, and I'm more on the clinical application end of it. Where the two join is some discoveries of what we call the default mode network. And that really is an area in the brain which is active when we're going about our daily life. It's very connected to one's sense of self, a separate self, where we're going about coping with life, doing our day-to-day dealings with life and staying safe within that mode. These are patterns of behavior that are encoded in our character as well as in our body, that on brain imaging, certain parts of the brain light up. We don't have to think about ourselves. It's something we carry with us, and we stay within this framework. What we see is certain medicines like psilocybin or meditation will cause a deactivation and a decreased connectivity in these regions of the brain. So we're liberated from this separate self experience, or what us psychoanalysts and psychiatrists tend to think of as ego, which are the constructions and frameworks we live in. Clinically, the implications are huge. We're doing studies right now looking at post-traumatic stress disorder and MDMA psychotherapy to release people from these traumatized states and very separate self states. In a more subtle way, Barry and I are working to really try and introduce and rethink how psychotherapy is practiced. People who show up in our office in pain can really have an experience of themselves out of normal mindset, where they can really understand and experience what Deepak talks about and discover it for themselves, what it is to be released from our mindsets, to experience the inner wisdom for healing and discovery within the body, to discover that this idea of self is in fact a construct. And that can be a very, very powerful experience and a liberating experience. There's also potential for foundational repair. You know, as Deepak says, we are all developed out of love from conception, even through developments of ourself with family units. But to actually be able to repair those earlier experiences, even of the constructions of self, in a different way where we're safe, is really a radical departure from the way we think of healing and psychotherapy. And as we get safe, the expansion of access to different parts of ourselves and access to the world around us just grows. And you can get into spiritual realms that Deepak talks about and has studied and written about in a very elegant way. It's not something we have to think about. It's something we find within ourselves and just have access to.
So let me, before I go to Barry, just summarize in one or two sentences what Gita has said very elegantly. The default mode network is the physical counterpart of your ego mind. The ego mind, which says, I am Deepak Chopra, I am Indian, I'm a male, and I'm separate from all of you. That is not the human condition when you're born. You know, it's not the human condition. You feel profound joy, unless you're wet or hungry, in which case there's discomfort. So what the ego, the separate self does, which is a socially induced hallucination, in Sanskrit it's called pragya aparad. Aparad means mistake, pragya means of the intellect. That as soon as we use thought, we separate ourselves. As soon as we use thought. And systems of thought have evolved from mythology to religion to theology to philosophy, now science. Science is also a system of thought. But what the wisdom tradition says, thought immediately filters experience. Because as soon as you have thought, then you've camouflaged the experience with an interpretation. Doesn't matter what the interpretation is. So what the work that Gita and Barry are doing is actually, in a way, doing what all spiritual traditions do, which say you have to go beyond thought to have direct experience of reality. And when you go, then you see the fundamental truth, which is inseparability. And science is getting there slowly, you know, the quantum vacuum and all these things about entanglement. But we are all entangled as minds, bodies. The whole universe is entangled as one activity, a wholeness. So Barry talked a little bit about the return of the memory of wholeness, which is what healing is. Healing, health, holy, they all mean the same thing. Healing, holiness is the sacred return to the memory of who we really are.
Thank you, Deepak. It's an honor to be here with you all. Oh. Hey guys. I'm going to speak about what Deepak and Gita have been talking about from a slightly different angle, and that I have been practicing as a psychotherapist for a long time. And so I see it differently, in different language, the same thing. So what Deepak is calling the default network is what the neuroscientists are seeing as brain activity. They're seeing it. And they're seeing that the brain activity is that part of your brain that takes care of everyday life, so that you don't walk in front of a bus. You don't put your hand on a flame, so that you remember who you love and who your neighbors are. That's why they call it default. It's the unthinking underpinning of everyday life. What Gita and I do, Gita is an analyst, psychoanalyst, and what we do in psychoanalytic practice is essentially work with people who are stuck in the default network. And that when people come to see us for psychotherapy, what they're actually saying is, I can't move. I can't get out of here. And it feels painful. And the painful is the not moving part. I don't know what it is. Maybe it feels like I'm not good enough. Maybe it feels like I still keep making mistakes in relationship. Same mistakes over and over again. What am I doing? But it's really painful. I'm in chaos. I don't understand. I'm lonely. I feel alone. I can't get out of that. I have panic. I have anxiety. I keep doing the same things over and over again, and I shouldn't be. And what we see is that they're stuck. They're stuck in this, what we are calling the ego self, but they're stuck in it. Then we take a drug, ketamine, which is a cardiac anesthetic, and it's totally legal. And when it is ingested...
You said totally legal.
Legal.
Yes.
It's a totally legal drug. Yeah. Non-recreational. Don't you dare. And when people go through the experience of the use of ketamine, I have, Gita has, there often is experienced a sense of release from this default network, from this ego. It's a release. And people will say to us, I feel safe. I haven't felt safe in 45 years. I feel safe right now. They find themselves breathing. My God, my diaphragm has been locked. I've been so scared. I haven't breathed a full breath in the last 30 years. I'm here. I feel I'm here. I'm not all chewed up with doubts and with history. My history isn't knocking on my back door anymore. I'm just here right now. And what does it translate into? Wholeness, oneness, a sense of being. Many people say, I'm feeling love. I'm feeling kindness. This is with ketamine. Ketamine. Not with all the other stuff. This is ketamine. I feel love, kindness, empathy, compassion, tenderness, and understanding. And that's what happens when the anxiety goes away. When the terror and the stuckness and all it hates, whether it's by the use of ketamine or meditation or dance or music or whatever you do, what comes out the other side is love. It's not something you have to actually do a lot of work to get. It's there when the anxiety goes away. It's there when the stuckness loosens. If you think about psychotherapy, all the different therapies are trying to get you to loosen up. You know, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, well, no, let's try this. Let's jump around. Let's do psychodrama. Let's play act the old family. Let's use your head. Let's remember who you were as a child. Let's go back. Let's regress. Let's go into a deep sleep or a deep focus. Every one of them is trying to get you to get out of this default network, even for a minute or 2 or 3 or 4. That's what they're trying to do. The ketamine gets you there in about 15 minutes. And that's why this is a revolution. It's a revolution. It's a revolution for psychiatrists. It's a revolution for healers of all sorts. It's a revolution for metaphysicians. It's a revolution. And as a wonderful cacao person was saying, I forget your name, I'm sorry. Where are you? Oh, there you are.
Name is not important, right?
Where are you?
We don't want to reinforce the ego.
The cacao. The cacao distorted me. So, but I'm wonderful. Wonderfully so. What happens is that exactly what Deepak was saying, we see in grounded physical terms in front of us, with people who show up in the office, start to see us by saying, I can't stop feeling panic. I'm in panic. The other psychiatrists say, well, here, take this pill. You know, go here, go check yourself into emergency, try this, we'll do this. When that person, a few minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours later, emerges out of that fear of going into a panic, for example, they feel, I'm here. Now, this is not a cure. That's not the cure. Because that state doesn't stay. But the state that does stay is that you can never go back once you've been open. Once you are safe, you've got a body memory that you cannot go back from. Or you do so only at great risk to what your soul is up to, and what your heart is up to, what your relationships are up to. It's a revelation. You'd like to say something about that?
I was just going to say, what Barry's really emphasizing is it's not the drug that's doing this. That really provides access to this inner way of knowing and the healing and the wisdom that resides within all of us. And that's just the most remarkable, I think, gift, is for us to really see and experience the poetry of the body that we typically don't really have access to in these psychedelics and medicines in small doses, carefully administered, allow us to really access that knowledge inside ourselves. And different ways, different access points are available. Some people access through yoga, meditation, as Barry was saying, dance, holotropic breathwork. There's many different ways in. What Barry and I offer is really this route in towards healing, wholeness, and reclaiming our full self.
Barry, you want to
I want to
finish
just
what you're
one more
saying
thing.
about that?
Suppose many people here who've been to a therapist, right? Of course. It's New York. It's New York. I mean, you're either a therapist or you want somebody who goes, and mostly you're both, right? Right? What it usually. It's even worse in Woodstock. I used to live there. So, what I was going to say is, suppose the premise you have going to see a therapist is not what's wrong with you, but what's right with you, and why can't you get there more often? Suppose that's the premise. Not what's wrong with you, fix me, but what's right with me, and help me be there more often. I mean, and imagine what kind of community of healers and helpers you would need to train or could train, who would know how to be with you. Imagine if the top-down medical model wasn't that. Imagine if it was a relational model. Can you? I want to say I want you to say about this too. I can tell you that some of the loveliest moments of my life have been when I've been with an individual who opens up and says, "I'm here now. I'm here now. I like myself. I'm not afraid of myself." An absolutely stunningly lovely moment for me, sitting with them. Not because I've diagnosed something wrong with them, but because I'm with them when they come into themselves and love themselves. And I'm not talking airy fairy here. I'm talking practical can happen. That's what I'm talking about. And this revolution, where psychedelics comes into healing and into consciousness, is really about the arousal of who you are at your best and helping you stay there more. It's not about continuation of the medical model where we diagnose what's wrong with you. Come on. And the ketamine, for example, gives you a taste of who you are at your best. And you can't go back from that once it's been delivered. It's there.
So now coming back to revisiting what they've said. This last weekend I was in Boston talking to my co-author, Rudy Hanzi, who's the professor of neuroscience at Harvard. And he's now seeing very clear evidence of the activation of the default mode network, inflammation, and links to even things like Alzheimer's. Of course, all this has to bear out with more research, but there's a clear link between activation of the default mode network, exaggerated, inflammation, and chronic illness, including Alzheimer's. And that kind of research has to now be replicated, but it's there. The other thing he told me, which is very fascinating, and it's again very preliminary, but some of his research, they're saying what is called DNA entanglement. Now, you've probably heard about quantum entanglement, but DNA entanglement means at the genetic level, all of us and every sentient being, including plants and animals and bacteria, are the same life, just with minor shuffling. With the minor shuffling, it's one life, it's one entity. Call it consciousness, call it non-local domain, call it God, call it the divine self. And what the default mode network is not the real self, but the socially induced hypnosis of the separate self. So this is very interesting to me that science is going there. Now, of course, if you're a student of spirituality, then you always hear these words: get rid of the ego. Get rid of the ego. Get rid of the ego. And people have acronyms. Ego stands for edging God out, EGO, etc., etc. Yeah, you didn't know that? Yeah, it's a kind of a cliche now. Ego stands for edging God out. And then nobody tells you how do you get rid of the ego, other than the fact that getting rid of the ego is the ultimate melodrama of the ego. Who is saying, who or what is saying, I want to get rid of the ego? So, the great Indian teacher Krishnamurti used to say, when the ego acts up, there's a sign. Anybody want? There's a physical sign for the ego. What do you think it is? What's the physical manifestation of the ego? You feel contracted. Okay, you feel contracted. And the more intense it is, the more contraction. You have a knot in your stomach, you have something in your heart, your muscles feel tight, even your posture reflects that, your breathing reflects that, your heart rate variability reflects that, your blood pressure reflects that. Everything about you in that moment is contracted. Okay, so next time you're feeling contracted, don't fight it. All you have to do is observe it. All you have to do is bring your awareness to the contraction till it eases off. Okay, that's what meditation does. That's what psychotherapy done properly should be doing. That's what psychodrama is about. That's what music is about. That's what poetry is about. That's what rituals are about. So even as we explore these different psychedelics, which is going to open already, I mean, cannabis is legal in Canada. It's getting legal in most states soon, hopefully, in the United States. And as soon as these things become legal, you have avenues to look at that. And already we are seeing evidence of decreased inflammation with cannabinoids, with cannabis, with THC, with CBDs. Is going to be part of regular therapy for inflammation combined with psychotherapy. Ayahuasca and all these other substances through rituals, and especially in shamanic traditions. By the way, I should mention that there's an exhibit outside of paintings by Pablo, and these are under the influence of ayahuasca. I encourage you to look at these paintings when you walk out the whole gallery. Paulette was very graciously put this on. Thank you, Paulette. And I always thank Paulette for... always thank you for bringing so much illumination. But now since we're on the topic, and since, this is going to become soon a big movement, it was when I was in medical school, right? And I should share with you, when I was in medical school at the age of 17, when I just joined medical school, we had 3 students, foreign exchange students, this is in India, from Harvard, and they asked me if I would like to try LSD. So my first experience with LSD was when I was 17, and then again 1 or 2 during medical school. And then as I traveled through the world, I of course have met shamans from every tradition, particularly Peru and Guatemala and Ecuador. And one of the things I realized is when you take away some of the sacred rituals that are part of these healing traditions, and they come from a deep understanding, even when we were doing the cacao ceremony, of the inseparability that the air is our breath, that the earth is recycling as our body, that the rivers and waters are our circulation, that the stars are the source of the atoms that are right now in your body, that there's no separation. Fundamentally, there's no separation, but we feel it because of the way we've constructed our civilization. And that sense of separation is at the root cause of everything from climate change. What is climate change? Inflammation. What is war? Inflammation. What is terrorism? Inflammation. What's the arms race about? Inflammation. What's eco-destruction? Inflammation. What's the cause of extinction of species? Inflammation. If we don't heed the call, which is emergent right now, then we are risking our extinction. And so it is time to resurrect these sacred traditions in a way that is responsible. There was a big revolution in the 60s. When I was in medical school, 70s, I thought the world was going to change. We had the peace movement, we had the feminist movement, Greenpeace was there, Vietnam was being protested against, anti-war movement was there, everything was there. And look where we are today. And that is because we didn't take responsibility. We thought it was all fun. That was what, Woodstock was all about. Okay, but it did open the window, and then it died because we lost the sense of sacredness for healing. So it's a time of great responsibility for all of us, that as we move forward, we don't spoil it again, and we'll have lost all these years. We've regressed 50 years. The world is in turmoil at the moment, and as I said, there's only 2 choices. One is revisit our true identity, and the other is risk our own extinction. So we are at the crossroads right now.
The singular experience that happens with people who use ketamine, for example, is they feel clear. They feel clear, and the experience they have in themselves translates to knowing what the world should be doing. It translates into understanding how it all fits together. That's how it translates. It's almost like you get a job description of how you should not only lead your life, but how you should be a neighbor, how you should be in a community. And that's the revolution. And when Deepak says about the sacredness of it, it is. This is a sacred time. This is not oh boy, psychedelics are on the market again. I mean, everything that's good can be used in a lot of different ways. what we are talking about is how to use it for the recovery of your sense of oneness, your sense of safety, your sense of brilliance in your own life.
Say a few words about cannabis. I think people are very curious. It's in the news. Everybody's talking about it. Cannabinoids, CBD, THC, inflammation, healing. I'd like you to share your views, Barry and Gita, both of you.
I just want to
And also about some of the newer things people are talking about, 5-MeO, MEO and all that, DMT.
Sure.
I think we should talk about these things.
Okay.
I just want to finish what Barry was saying and add just one more thing. One of the most gratifying things for me personally working with these medicines is people come to me in psychic distress and pain. That's why they show up in my office. And once they do recover their own peace of mind and safety, just automatically, because all their resources and energies are not focused on managing and coping with themselves, without any prompting, they turn to worrying and concern for their family members, for their neighbors, for their community, for the environment. And I do think that's the natural condition of all of us when we're not in pain, when we're free. And it is such an elegant process and such an honor to be part of helping one really recover oneself. It is really very much like sacred work. So I just wanted to say that. But to answer cannabis, it's a really interesting trend that's happening, and everyone, I think, has a lot of excitement about it because it is another medicine. All of these medicines, I think, have very different signatures and very different atmospheres almost, but they really all serve the same function to allow one to get out of typical mindset and access deeper wisdom beyond the normal ego-bound states we reside in. And so there's different ways, different doses, different qualities they possess, but ultimately I think they all serve the same functions, even though people will talk about different experiences and different, sort of routes into themselves. Some medicines are quite harsh on the body and others are gentler. And there is a lot of work even within research to a tendency in a lot of the research studies to use single dose, high dose experiences which lead to very profound ego dissolution effects, kind of like ayahuasca ceremony. People have this rebirth experience which can be quite profound, which is one model of working with these medicines. Barry and I tend to use smaller doses, which are much gentler and stick within character structure and self-structure, so one can actually have an experience from within one's own sensuality. So there's different, I think, techniques and different ways of working and utilizing these medications and substances, all which have their merits. And cannabis is a new one, which Barry maybe would like to say something about.
Many of these substances are often referred to as teacher plants. And cultures for the last 50,000 years have thought of plants as being just as conscious in their own way as human beings are, as they are. They've revered the consciousness of the trees, the ground, the weather, the fire. It's all got consciousness. And so the impact of cannabis at this point, I'm saying this from myself, I treat it as if it's about consciousness. And what am I learning from this? And usually I learn most when I'm afraid to do it. When I find that I'm afraid to actually go into something, I say, okay, this is the path. I've got to go down this little road here. And cannabis, I'm Canadian, by the way, and cannabis, thank you, thank you, yeah, mon pays. Cannabis is a way, they call it, in the bad old days, they called it the threshold drug, which means that it leads to all this bad stuff. So that's what they meant by it. But used properly now, it is a way to get through the first little bit of fear. It's a way to get through, it's a way to jumpstart your freedom. I personally use it at times, have used it at times in Canada.
Or California.
Yeah. By the way, there's a movement to change the country's name to Canada. I just, I don't know where I heard that, but it's used in conjunction with other medications as an extender and as a brightener, as a way to soften the impact of some of these medications on the body, and it's very good. It's very good for doing that. Beyond that, I don't have a working expertise with it, other than it really seems to work with ketamine at times. And I do want to say one thing here. Just want to say one thing. We're speaking about the use of drugs and medications as if one size fits all. It does not, and that in fact every person in this room has a different constituent self, a different emotional, vibrational presence, a different character structure, a different reaction to the same things, and so your reaction to these medications that we're talking about will not be the same across the board. It is the job of the skilled clinician. That's why there's a huge amount of training involved here. It's the job of the skilled clinician to know who can take what will happen, how much of it, how much is going to be, how much should I be around when that person is taking it, who's a candidate for what and who's not. That's just responsible. It is not a one-size-fits-all thing.
So I want to share a couple of stories with you about my insights into this whole world. In the year 2001, when 2002, somewhere around there, my father passed away, and my brother and I went to India to do the cremation. And as part of the ritual is we take the ashes to Rishikesh and the source of the Ganges, and we go through all kinds of rituals. And so as we were driving, we saw, and I see that there are some Indians in the audience, we saw these sadhus. Do you know what sadhus are? These Shaivites with ash on their forehead, and they were in samadhi, but they weren't moving at all. So, I asked our taxi driver, I said, what are they smoking? He said, ganja, sir. Does anyone know what ganja is? It's a cannabinoid. It's a cannabis derivative. So my brother, who was then the chief of medicine or dean at Harvard Medical School, he looked at the taxi driver and he said, can we get some? The taxi driver said, no, sir, you have to be enlightened. Otherwise, you don't qualify. Now, of course, if you look deeply inside the hymns of the Rig Veda, how many people are familiar with the Rig Veda? 8th, 9th, and 10th mandala. The hymns are all devoted to rituals for something called soma. And soma, we don't know what it is, but it could have been a psilocybin derivative. But soma is very much part of the rituals that the ancient priests did to give people a glimpse into reality. Now, if you look at other spiritual traditions, and I'm saying that at the risk of being blasphemous, but the voice of God and all those experiences in the Old Testament, including Moses and manna and all that, many people think that was actually the manna that fell from heaven, and the earth was fungus and induced a state of what we call reality, because this is not reality. This is a narrow band of human perceptual experience. We call it reality. But this is a very narrow band of human perceptual experience. What does this world look like to other sentient beings. Have you ever read about this butterfly that's called the painted lady? Anybody knows about the painted lady? You do. So she, the painted lady, she smells the world through her antenna. She tastes the world through her feet. Taste buds are in the feet. She hears through her wings. The wings are her hearing apparatus. And she has 30,000 lenses in her eyes that move like a kaleidoscope, presumably giving her an experience of shimmering shapes, colors, and forms. We have no idea what reality is to other sentient beings. What is it to a snake that moves and navigates through infrared? What is it to a honeybee that does a waggle dance? You know, when a honeybee comes from a grove, and it comes back to its hive, it does a 15-second waggle dance. And all the other bees, the worker bees, know which way to go to find that flavor of nectar. What is that language in a honeybee that tells the others, this is where you go? Okay. So what we call everyday reality is a very narrow bandwidth of human experience in that which is infinite. This is a finite expression of the infinite. You break out of this narrow bandwidth, and this is the glimpse that you get, is, oh, I am infinite. And I've squeezed myself into the volume of a body and the span of a lifetime. Once you do that, then you create constructs, other constructs. This is a body. There's a mind in the brain, and that's the world. It's all one thing, and it's only consciousness. If there is only one thing that's real, it's God. That's it. The rest is a story. The rest is a human interpretation. The only thing that exists is God, is the divine, the infinite, having a finite experience. And, you know, we use these phrases. We are spiritual beings having a human experience, and if you like science, you can say we are non-local beings having a local experience. But the fact is, everyday experience is not fundamental reality. This, which we are calling the world, our body, this table, this shoe, is all one entity. It's one entity that's and being experienced as infinite diversity. One consciousness, innumerable interpretations, innumerable modes of looking, and innumerable objects observed, but still the same object, which is the self. Not the separate self, not the ego self, but the self of all self. That's the basis of what we call Atman is Brahman, that the self of the individual is the self of the universe, but the self of the butterfly is also the self of the universe.
Can you imagine psychiatrists hearing this? Except that we're here to tell you it's real. That's what this is about. We're on the bridge. See? We're on the bridge.
Gita. I think we have a few minutes for questions. We should take them. A few minutes. Shall we do that? Let's do it.
Can you expand upon how cannabis and ketamine work together in, you said it acts as a gateway?
What I was saying was that the gateway thing is that cannabis, legal cannabis, well used or properly used, allows for anxiety that would be associated with a deep dive into yourself to soften. It has a way of quelling or calming the anxiety, the fear of going farther in yourself. The ketamine researchers have been exploring the impact of using ketamine and cannabis together. And some have given people cannabis at the start of a ketamine session, then the ketamine. And those two together, depending on the grade of cannabis, tends to elaborate and extend the experience of the ketamine.
And I would say that this is, once again, very personalized. There are people who do not have good reactions to cannabis, so it really has to be individualized. But in certain places where facilitators are using these medicines together and they're available legally, sometimes with people who do well with cannabis, with tiny doses, you can have a deeper experience. It can extend the length of the experience as well as the intensity. And Phil Wolfson, who's written a lot and studied and is a pioneer in ketamine, talks a lot about this and has written a lot on this subject. But this does get into the aspect of it being, a practice that is an art as well as a science. And you really have to look at the individual and really tailor it to each situation, each person. And indeed, there are people where it's not at all appropriate for them, and there are other better paths or preparation that is required before one can comfortably and safely have an experience.
Let me actually add to a little bit to that. See, one of the problems with anybody who's so entrenched in this perceived reality has with anything that takes you beyond boundaries. If you ask physicists, which I did many years ago, I asked quantum physicists because they all argue with each other. There are about 20 different interpretations. There are about 20 different interpretations of quantum mechanics, even though the math is everybody agrees on. So I once asked over 100 physicists, is there one thing you guys can agree on? And they did. And that is that fundamental reality, there are no boundaries. Okay, so this boundary, the boundary between this and this and this is artificial. It's a perceptual boundary. It's not fundamental. But we are so used to this separation, these boundaries. Everything seems to have a boundary, when in fact there are no boundaries. It's all one unbounded reality. That when you have an experience where suddenly these shapes and forms become ambiguous, become ill-defined, and the boundaries start to disappear, including the boundary of your own body, right? This is your identity. It can evoke, that transitional period can evoke intense anxiety till you go through it. And then once you go through it, ecstasy, okay? Unbounded joy, once you've crossed the boundary. Now, when you talk to people who have near-death experiences, it's very similar. Or when you talk to people who have out-of-body experiences, which can be induced by these substances, but they can be induced through holotropic breathing and meditation, and these days through VR and augmented immersive realities. There are lots of ways to getting rid of the experience that I'm bound, I'm squeezed into the volume of this body and the span of a lifetime. So there are many ways to do that, but there's a transition. So people who have these experiences, they come back and say, it was so joyful that I didn't want to come back. Okay, it was so ecstatic that I did not want to come back, but whatever, they did come back. But this raises a very important question for scientists, for neuroscientists. How do we get an in-body experience? It's not that the out-of-body experience is extraordinary. That's the real experience. The real you is not inside your body. Your body is an experience in you, right? So how do we get an in-body experience without being in it? This is amazing that we can all collectively hypnotize ourselves into a false experience of who we are. Because there's no one inside you. When people say a body dies and the soul leaves, that's inaccurate. Okay? The soul has nowhere to go. It has no boundaries. Okay? It's timeless. It's spaceless, it's dimensionless, it's infinite. It has no boundaries. So death is another human construct based on a misperception of reality. What is born in every moment is an experience. What dies in every moment is an experience, not the experiencer, because the experiencer has nowhere to go. It's a non-local universe. The timeless cannot be lost in time. So who we are is timeless, but our perceptual experience and our interpretation of perceptual experience creates the constructs of space-time, causality, birth and death. So if you ask a person who's totally liberated, what happens to you when you die? The answer is, I was never born. The timeless remains timeless.
That's what we think about that. How are we for time?
It's a construct, but we're running out of it. But we are running out of it. Two more.
So then how do we explain my hunger?
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak on microdosing and how if you use that in your clinical practice and how.
I am using microdosing in different ways. I don't think of it as microdosing because it's so specific to the person, but oftentimes it's been remarkable how I've been able to wean people off their conventional antidepressants and either have deep experience for deeper healing and inner work, sometimes even utilizing tiny doses of ketamine for symptom relief. And certainly, all over United States, high doses of ketamine intravenously are being used for their antidepressant effects. But I'm much more interested in how can we access the inner healing towards really getting to sort out and resolve some of these problems. But tiny doses intermittently can be very, very helpful. And even a small dose of ketamine, for example, for some individuals can cause symptom release of anxiety and depression for even up to 4 to 6 weeks. It's so person-specific, however, that it really has to be, considered on a one-to-one basis. Some people are using ketamine on a daily tiny doses for an antidepressant effect. That's much more of a pharmacological approach, and as you can hear from this talk, I'm less interested in transferring, conventional psychopharmacology with these medicines, although there's a lot of evidence growing and studies supporting that ketamine is an incredible, very good antidepressant with a different mechanism of action. But when you're talking about microdosing, we're really talking about how do we wind up utilizing these medicines for symptom management to allow people have access to their inner healing intelligence for deeper work. So ultimately relying less and less on the doses.
One more question, Barry, go
I
ahead.
just want to add, who asked the question? You asked the question. Everything we're talking about is simply a doorway into you owning your life and you balancing, you working with yourself. Everything we're talking about is an assist so that you open up to being your own healer, your own, that you're free to be who you are. Microdosing seems to allow some people to do that.
One more question. Go ahead.
I can speak loudly if this helps. One question. Thank you for being in this conversation, because I've actually journeyed with Mother Ayahuasca and experienced this oneness in a very particularly profound way. But my inquiry is along the lines of integration. How, after having this profound bridge in, this access point, how do you not have a great high? How do you integrate it so that it deepens and the healing and the openness and that oneness really stays and you can build on it? What would you say is the word in your practice?
Yes, what she's saying is you have a wonderful opening, you have a sense of oneness and wholeness, you've gone to a great sort of reclamation of yourself. Now, how do you integrate that into your daily life? How do you, after the experience, what do you do?
And download it.
To keep it in there. So I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to give this over here. That's exactly why this is a revolution in psychiatry. What we call psychotherapy is actually a healing relationship between two people or one person and a number of others. There are facilitators and therapists who know how to help you integrate that over weeks and months. As opposed to treating you as somebody who's sick and trying to get over it, they'll treat you as somebody who's getting well and help you maintain it. That's exactly what's happening. That's why this is a revolution.
And it also answers your question when you said Mother Ayahuasca and the rituals. The rituals trap the energy, release it, and then integrate it. Without the ritual, it's not so easy.
I was just curious to understand.
Anything, Gita, you want to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that it does speak to the idea that the process in therapy then becomes about integration and using the relationship and thinking about the confines of self and character structure and how to really challenge that. And that is the therapy. That really is a different model of therapy, which winds up being about the wisdom that one has acquired and to really use the therapeutic relationship to continue that process and find different ways out of that confines.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
Ultimately, the integration happens when you develop an inner conversational self-reflection language that replaces the external language that comes at you from the healer, the therapist, the doctor. Ultimately, the job of the integrator is to teach you how to talk with yourself. And conventional psychology doesn't do that so well. There are fantastic therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists out there who know how to do that. But ultimately, that's where the integration comes in. Teaching you a language you go home with, that you can self-refer to, that you can look in the mirror and remind yourself of who you are, that you can feel the currents going through your body, that you know when inflammation happens.
Last week I was at a consciousness conference and a Japanese researcher came up to me and he said, I have a new mathematical formula. And usually, when people say I have something new, you wonder if it's really worth listening to unless many other people are also talking about it. I said, what is it? He said, 0 is equal to infinity is equal to 1.
It's God's phone number.
Huh? But that says it all, right? 0 is the starting point, and it's the same as the infinite, because who you really are is a formless being that is infinite, and you're one with all that exists. Gita, thank you. Barry, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Deepak.